Now, I would like to give the floor to our another supervisor of our project, Professor Cleminson from United Kingdom. Please.
Thank you very much. I think at this stage in the proceedings it is no longer premature to congratulate the organizers of this conference on what they have achieved, not merely in terms of advertising and promoting the project itself, but also in organizing an excellent symposium on the subject and related matters. I certainly feel that I have learned something in the past day and a half, and I can hardly be an exception in this. Equally, I must express my appreciation for being invited here. Thank you very much. It is well worth it. Now, what I propose to do in this brief spot is to survey the quite rich experience that already exists with digitizing the Codex Suprascelsius or a part thereof, and to have a look at the various digitized editions and see what they do, what the differences between them are, both in terms of aims of realization, and to extrapolate from this some general considerations about the digital edition, not so much in terms of what it should do, which has just been very amply treated and rather better than I could have done it, but in terms of what should underlie it. Now, as you will see from the combined bibliography and selidography that has just been distributed, the Codex Suprascelsius, of course, the original is this manuscript now in 3 parts, which has been rendered in other forms quite extensively, starting with the first edition by Miklosic, which was transcribed, or rather printed from the transcription which had been made by Kopita, and which is itself now in the National University Library in Ljubljana. And then subsequently from the manuscript itself by Sirianov, whose work again has received thorough appreciation earlier today. It was published in 1904 and reprinted in Graz roughly half a century later. And then the final paper edition by Zailov and Capaldo, which is not actually an original edition of the manuscript, it simply reprints Sibelianov's transcription of the manuscript. It's not done it again. It does introduce 69 corrections, which they noticed where Sibelianov had slipped up. But what is new in that edition is that we have photographic reproductions of the manuscript itself and the parallel Greek text reconstructed by Capaldo. Then we move to electronic editions, and I find that already out of date because, of course, I should have included the turning the pages digital representation which this very project has constructed and which is now available. I didn't realize it was already available. But apart from that, we do have the digitized images of that part of the manuscript which is in Ljubljana, which in many cases are actually easier, clearer than the corresponding images in the printed edition. Civiliano's transcription, not the whole book for some reason, but just the transcription of the manuscript and the accompanying apparatus is also available in electronic form. So those two or three one might talk of as digitized rather than digital editions or reproductions of the manuscript. And then we come to the transcription. Again, the transcription is a transcription of a transcription. It was made by chiefly under the supervision of Jopo Winchester in Helsinki from the transcription published by Civilianov in using only ASCII characters, which at that time was a very good thing because it meant that it was more or less immune from corruption, and in a format which is based on the beta transcription for classical Greek, which certainly people of my generation will remember. I'm not sure about the younger people in the hall. Then, subsequent to that, there is the Titus edition, which is basically the Helsinki edition put back into Cyrillic with some quite considerable linguistic adaptations. There is Paul and Simple, which we've just again seen presented at some length. I won't go into that. And there is the same chapter, Paul and Simple, and also chapter 1 of the manuscript, which are now available in the Norwegian project entitled Pragmatic Resources in Old Indo-European Languages. The acronym for which is PREOTKRIVANE, which of course to Russian speakers suggests a worm making its way through the manuscript. And that so far is it. So if I may, I would like to review these, bearing in mind the 4 pillars of electronic text originally enunciated by David Birnbaum in Blagoevgrad a number of years ago, which are structure, that is to say, you're not just giving, as he put it then, you're not just using the computer as a typewriter, you're actually embodying the hierarchical and structural features of the text that you are recording in your transcription. Portability, in other words, it can work on any platform. Preservation, again, this has been touched on in the previous paper, and multiple use. So, if we look at the Helsinki corpus, this is a text file. Transcribes Civiliano's transcription in ASCII, and it is the plainest of plain text. You've got the URL there, so I won't, in the very limited time available, spend that on demonstrating it. You're probably familiar with it anyway, and if you're not, you could look it up. It's the plainest of plain text. The only editorial additions are line numbers and a line final hyphen where a word is split across lines. And he transcribes Civiliano very accurately, including the diacritics. As far as the chapter we're concerned with, the chapter 14, which is called the Simple, is concerned, I have only discovered 2 places where there are definite errors of transcription. One of them is a monster, which is a non-word instead of Vishenshnago, evidently the demon got into the transcription at that point. And the chestnutzy with an e instead of a use. And these are kind of human error. But rather more curious are 3 instances where it gives a smooth breathing instead of a cartilization hook. And since these 2 are quite distinct, both in the manuscript and in Civiliano's transcription, I wonder the fact that you get this same error repeated, whether there's some sort of mechanical error that has taken place during the transcription. Encoding issues that arise in this transcription are that the spacing circumflex is used for both the palatalization hook and the camorra. However, since these are in complementary distribution, this is a resolvable ambiguity. And also the use of the exclamation mark, again for two different purposes, before a whole word indicates that the word is under the title, whereas within a word it indicates that the letter immediately following is a superscript, with or without a criterion. Now this does actually raise an interesting issue for electronic text, because titla are used in Suprasълският to indicate nomina sacra. So that means that they're essentially anchored to the word, certainly on the semantic level, and not to the character, which is conceptually different from how these things are encoded in electronic text, because we typically think of the titla as a character in relation, in spatial relation to other characters rather than to a word. Although, of course, it has to be rendered somehow. So this means that, in fact, mechanically, you can't distinguish the use of the exclamation mark in this particular transcription, and therefore the Bulgaria is the only character which isn't encoded, or alternatively, which is included even though it isn't there. And titla likewise cannot be placed accurately in the text without some sort of human intervention. The other encoding issue here is that the medial point, which is the most frequent form of punctuation in the manuscript, is encoded not as a medial point but as a point on the line, except where direct speech immediately follows, where it's encoded as a colon. So this introduces a distinction which is not in the original, where direct speech is in fact not always preceded by any sort of punctuation at all. There are, however, no markup issues regarding this particular transcription because there is no markup. So what we have is a fully portable text. It's standardized as ASCII. It's minimally structured, and therefore, as far as its use is concerned, you can do nothing and everything. Since it's a complete encoding of the text, it can be used for any purpose, but the user will have to do all the work himself. There's no pre-existent markup which you can use for it. Titus, which is the thesaurus, thesaurus in the germanischen Text- und Sprachmaterial, is basically a re-encoding of the Helsinki text within a much larger corpus, marked up to allow advanced lexical searching. It reproduces the Helsinki text exactly while re-encoding the characters, not necessarily on a one-to-one basis. And so there are definite encoding issues here. It's advertised as UTF-8, and while all the characters are indeed UTF-8 characters, they are not always the right ones. So, for example, you get работна instead of the mutated you have what I have discovered is the Abkhazian Z for Zemlya and so on. And not all of these can be corrected by a simple substitution. Obviously, if you take the Titus text and do a global change, replacing Abkhazian Z with Zilor, then you get it back to what it should be. But this can't always be done quite so simply, because, for example, as a legacy from the Helsinki encoding, the diacritics precede the character on which they stand instead of following it, as they ought to in Unicode. Although, in fact, it is possible to re-encode these combinations so that they come out as they should be in Unicode, once you've worked out how to do it. It took me all day to work out how to do it. Once I finally got there, it is a matter of seconds. However, there are, as we know, two forms of the small use. in the manuscripts. The more usual one stands for the yen, the dictated form as a rule, and the enclosed one, or with two parallel lines, which is usual after a consonant. And both of these in Titus are represented by a single character, which is the standard small use. Similarly, the digraph uk is used for both digraph uk and monograph uk. And what turns out to be a space in Greek koronis is used for both the spiritus lenis and the paiok. And these are not resolvable ambiguities, because the characters are not in complementary distribution. Therefore, what we have in Titus is not a totally accurate representation of the manuscript, and not restorable either. And you might think, for example, that the yen, the ordinary small use, is used initially and after vowels, and that the closed small use is used elsewhere, but that information isn't in Titus. So should you proceed on that assumption and risk introducing errors? Well, no, you shouldn't, because you will introduce errors. The open small use does in fact occur in the manuscript in positions which are neither initial nor post-vocalic. It's rare, but it nevertheless is present. So what we have here, in fact, is a loss of information in comparison with the source text. So there are encoding issues, and there are also markup issues, because if you put this chapter, the whole single chapter, as encoded in Titus, through a validator, you get more than 3,000 errors. Now, this, of course, does not mean that yours to give it made more than 3,000 mistakes. Far from it. The initial encoding was made in 1998, and many of the errors that the validator turns up are, in fact, simply left over from earlier versions of HTML where they were permissible. For example, a lack of distinction between uppercase and lowercase, unquoted attribute values, and so on. And the rest result from what is essentially a customization of the standard for the specific purposes of Titus, the overwhelming majority being overlapping elements. Again, this is a consequence of a project which was doing something that the standards did not cater for at the time that it was initiated. Nowadays one might, or indeed nowadays one does, hope to achieve the same ends within the standards, but this is because they've developed very considerably since then, and in fact down a rather different path from that adopted by Titus. The important thing is that Titus works for what it does, which is by and large lexical searching, and to a lesser extent analysis. It is primarily a concordance, so the T after all does stand for dissolves. This means that the texts in Titus are not really usable for anything else, because they embody customizations of earlier versions of standards, which are quite different from the present versions of the standards. I should stress that this is not a criticism. Titus has taken an existing electronic edition, which is the Helsinki corpus, and exploited it for the aims of its project. We have not lost anything, because we still have the Helsinki edition, and we have gained something, because we now have Titus as well. It's a good example of how one can use an electronic edition for specific purposes, but it is not as such an edition, nor a model for editions. Paul the Simple, or not so simple, we have just seen, so I will not spend time repeating what has already been said. It's an edition of chapter 14, encoded on the basis of, as we've heard, the Helsinki, but corrected against Zaim of Capaldo, so in a sense independent of the Helsinki corpus, but still dependent on Sibiryanov. Being such, it has eliminated the errors of the Helsinki transcription, but it does have the wrong use in the pronoun sen. It's 88 vector 22nd. introduced one error of its own. As far as encoding is concerned, it's fully conformant to Unicode 5.1. Interesting peculiarity is that it includes yellow as 2 characters, whereas the other encoding is treated as 1 character. Curiously, and I think it's badly at page 6 verse line 8, in the original, the first element of the yellow has the form of a front year and not the back year. And one would have thought that all the simple, which encodes yellow as 2 characters, and therefore has an opportunity to distinguish between the two, which the other existing editions don't, would have been anxious to make it, but it doesn't. And it's also curiously inconsistent in its treatment of the Pyroc, using Pyroc for it 4 times and the apostrophe 3 times. They appear identical in the manuscript. I suspect this is the result of different encoders working on different parts of the text and taking slightly inconsistent resolutions of the same problem. It encodes superscripts using markup, which I think is a good thing, and does not include any diacritics in traditional terms or non-spacing characters in Unicode terms, except for the parameterization book. And obviously on this it proceeds from the assumption that these have no grammatical or phonological significance and are therefore irrelevant to the purpose of its project. But it does mean that there is information in the manuscript that is omitted from the text. Like Helsinki, it introduces the colon before narrated speech, but not consistently. As far as markup issue is concerned, there is one error. There is a missing XML-NS attribute from the root element. It shows alternative views, which, as we have seen, making quite extensive use of JavaScript for the purpose. And it also introduces a division into paragraphs as determined by Lugo's edition of the Historia Lausiaca. So this is introducing a new level of structure into the text. It's designed for a specific purpose and it does it extremely well. And because both encoding and markup are standard, it can be taken and used for other purposes, so long as you aren't interested in diacritics. It may be transformed or have new markup and structure added. And this has been done, because the Proekt, which is a corpus of texts in Greek, Old Church, Slavonic, Armenian, Gothic and Latin, marked up for linguistic analysis, both at word and sentence level, does not in fact state the source of its encoded text of Paul Simple, but the treatment of the Pyroc and punctuation reveal that it is none other than Paul Simple, as done by David Gelbach and company at Pittsburgh, which it reproduces. Nice to notice en passant that the techniques that we can use for determining relationships between manuscripts also work very much on text. Encoding issues, well, it's Unicode conformed, of course, like the source, so it chooses to encode Yeri as a single character, and for some reason it replaces the archaic form of Zinda with the modern form, and the Pyroc with the Gaelic. Superscripts are encoded as characters, not with markup. And like its immediate predecessor, it has no non-spacing characters except the parameterization hook. And both XML and HTML files are available, taking the form of a tree bank within which the individual words have also been annotated with part-of-speech tags. And I think that what you get in your interface is dynamically generated, so that in practice this means a series of interlinked files embodying different levels of structure, so that elements from one file may be linked to and embedded in another, attaching different levels of data to the particular unit and enabling the generation of different views. So the structure is quite complex in terms of XML or HTML, but the underlying structure of the text on which this is all based consists of a division into sentences, which are themselves divided into words, spaces, and punctuation. The chapter divisions of the Historia Lausiaca are retained, indicated by milestone tags, but there is no indication of the structure of the manuscript, neither line nor page divisions, which I would thought was something of a disadvantage for the linguist, in that he can say that something occurs somewhere in the Codex Supprasaliensis, but which page it's on, well, we can find that out, but not from the Royal edition. And since the encoding is standard and the documents are well formed, it would be possible to transform this data for other purposes, but given the nature and complexity of the markup, it's unlikely that anyone would want to do so except for excursions deeper into the world of corpus linguistics. So, we have these four editions. How well do they represent the text? They're all, to a greater or lesser extent, dependent on Siberianov, and fortunately, Siberianov's edition is a very good one. However, because of its privacy and because it raises fundamental questions of editing, it's worth subjecting it to a fairly minute analysis. And it's interesting also that the distinction which we tend to make in our world of electronic text, and certainly in the world of Unicode, between letter characters, non-spacing characters, and punctuation characters, seems in practice already to have been made. That distinction seems already to have been made by Siberianov, in that he treats the three categories rather differently. If we take letters first, and there's only one instance in this chapter of the manuscript which might be considered a mistake in Siberianov's transcription. This is the last letter of the third line of 86 recto, which is a superscript 1. Now, Siberianov normally prints superscripts as superscripts, but in this case he doesn't, which must therefore be considered an oversight on his part. Neither, of course, does anyone else, because they're all reliant on Siberianov, which shows the importance of the initial transcription. Even its mistakes are perpetuated in subsequent editions, so it is very important to get it right first time. There are two instances of broad on in this chapter, both mentioned by Siberianov in his notes, but in both cases he actually prints a narrow on. All subsequent editors follow the printed text and ignore the note. Siberianov is certainly justified in his practice, particularly if he regards the two as living variants. And if others take the same view, of course they may regard this distinction as irrelevant to their purposes. However, the two forms are clearly contrasted in the manuscript. This is not one of those manuscripts where the letter can be of all kinds of different widths, so you don't really know whether something is supposed to be narrow or broad. There's a very clear distinction between the two in Supprasaliensis. So we have to ask ourselves whether we are justified in making any sort of a priori assumption about their use. Punctuation is represented by 4 signs: the medial points, which is frequent, and 2 others which are exceptional. Again, it's noticeable that the medial point is normally followed by a space, which is not normally used anywhere else in the manuscript. This is written in scriptio continua, which again, but not always, again, makes one think perhaps one should treat the space as a character in the edition. This also illustrates really the extent to which encoding is interpretation. And we know what a letter character should be with rather more certainty than a diacritic, and at higher levels of encoding, as for example word division, the knowledge we bring to the task is more important. And this is actually what we're doing in dividing it into words, which I think we ought to do. It makes life terribly difficult. don't, is basically what the medieval reader was also doing. He was bringing his knowledge of what is a word to the text so he could understand it, even though there were no spaces between the words. And there are one or two cases where the different editions have interpreted word division differently. So again, everything is to a certain extent interpretation. So what are the conclusions from all this? Firstly, the conclusion is that only the Helsinki transcription is really an edition. All the others, I mean the electronic ones, all the others are already analyses, studies based on the edition, which involve the addition of markup which is specific to their purposes and the omission of irrelevant data. Therefore, an edition must be based on the manuscript. Even the best editions may contain errors, and these will be perpetuated in derived texts. Even the best reproductions may be less clear or misleading, so unless we have reproductions which are digitally enhanced, which may perhaps be of some use to us, only Davidson, it must be complete. So we should have the diacritics, even though most of us will want to get rid of them when we come to be using it. Though some of us won't. I mean, one thinks of Moshim's study of the manuscript, which took a great deal of account of the diacritics. In other words, the edition must not prejudge what is relevant. We're not doing other people's research for them, we're enabling them to do it for themselves. So this applies to diacritics, it applies to punctuation. And finally, some form of reference system is desirable. Electronic text, after all, has abolished the page. In other words, what I mean to say is that we must preserve the original metadata as well as the data. Now, I came to these conclusions specifically in the context of the edition of Suprasълski. I do not claim that they are universal. Particularly in Suprasълski, for example, in particular, is an exceptionally clear manuscript, which helps very much. In dealing with certain other manuscripts, one might find that there were encoding issues which we don't encounter here. But I hope what I have done is given some sort of illustration of how encoding can affect our perception of the manuscript, how it can be used, and even some idea of what the basic underlying text from which everything that David Birnbaum was talking about in the previous paper is to be generated must look